Welcome back to Making Imagination, the podcast that looks at animated filmmaking one craft at a time. I'm Wes, your host. Today, I sat down with Tony Bancroft to talk about feature animation. He's the director of Mulan. He's a Disney veteran with over 30 years of animation experience. You may know him as an animation podcaster, animator of Pumbaa or Kronk. However you know him, chances are, if you're plugged into the animation world, you know him. I sat down with Tony to learn more about feature animation, projects he's worked on, roles he's worked on. This is that conversation. So, Tony, for the listening audience, can you briefly kind of tease out some of the major differences between feature animation and, say, episodic or even shorts?
Well, I have a long history with that question, to tell you the truth, because my answer has changed over the years. When I first started out in animation in the 90s, it was the heyday of feature animation, especially certainly at Disney. And there was definitely a distinction. And when I was at CalArts going to school, you started hearing about how some students really wanted to get into the new place. Hanna-Barbera and Cartoon Network was just starting up, and they were excited about that. And then there was kind of a more snobby kind of look at, well, if you really want to be an animator, you got to work at Disney and feature animation. And Disney was starting their one Saturday morning kind of thing. And so they had a whole TV side that was gearing up in the 90s. And it was definitely like, and I know it sounds very snobby, but from the feature animation side, when I started working in feature animation, everybody looked down upon if you had to start out in TV animation, or God forbid, if you couldn't make it in feature animation, you ended up in TV animation. It was like, that was definitely, lower skill sets and all that kind of stuff. And there was a pay difference. Everything was different. It was definitely, the minor league and the major league, and feature animation was the major league. That was the majors. And you could say that still exists to somewhat, but TV animation has changed dramatically, and certainly streaming and the onset of Prime and Disney Plus and Netflix and all that has brought upon series work now. You can't even really call it TV series or TV animation. It's just series, and the budgets have gone up. But even at like Disney. At Disney Studios, Disney TV animation, the kinds of shows they're making now, the budgets they're putting into them, they look good, and there's no turning your nose up at any of that stuff anymore. The quality level has surged on the TV production side or the series side, whatever you want to call it, to a point where people move around pretty easily, and with no shaming to their career by having a resume that has TV and then feature and then series. And then, that kind of back and forth I've been seeing happening in the last, I don't know, I want to say 5 years, that has been, I think, really good for the industry, because it's not as competitive and there's not such a low feeling towards TV or series work anymore. But for me, I started and trained in feature animation. I've always been in feature animation. I've freelanced a little bit. I'll just be honest. I have done a little bit of projects here and there on the TV side, but it was, earlier days, and I guess I didn't have a good experience so much. I prefer to be in features. To me, and my upbringing at CalArts, California Institute of the Arts, where I went to school, it was always feature focused. It was always classic Disney animation, full animation. I like that. So if anything, I just have my own biases now, but I think the industry doesn't have so much biases anymore.
Now, you mentioned going to CalArts with your brother Tom. So I've heard in interviews with other animators and other animation directors, there seems to be a point in time when they realize, oh, I can do this as a living. There are names in the credits, and that was somebody's job. Did you have that kind of experience looking at feature animation, or was it always something that was a possibility and something, maybe a distant star, but something you wanted to shoot for?
Yeah, again, I've been doing this for over 35 years. So when Tom and I, my twin brother and I, first got into feature animation, or animation in general, It was a very viable thing. Everybody, all the examples around us, which were basically our teachers at Cal Arts, they would work at Disney during the day and then come and teach us in the evening. Um, they were professionals in the industry. None of them didn't have a job, but there was also a rarity of talent, and there was more going on than so that the need was it was very flipped in that studios had more need of talent than talent needed jobs. So most people that really put themselves forward in any way with their portfolios and their teaching and learning, that they probably got jobs. They were out there. Everybody was the example was okay. It's not you do have to prove yourself to get a higher level job. Again, feature animation was higher level, but a lot of people started in TV animation and then would hopefully work their way up into features. But most people were getting jobs out of school because there was that need. That's changed dramatically now, and it's the opposite. There's more students, there's more people learning animation, wanting to get into animation. Getting that first break is really difficult now, especially with the downturn that's happened in the last 2 years in animation, where streaming videos services have laid off a lot of people. They were just overzealous with their spending during the COVID years and stuff, the pandemic that really started the surge. And now that bubble has bursts basically. And so there's a real downtime in the industry. I really feel for my students basically, because now I'm a teacher, a professor at Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm raising up the next generation. They're super excited, and they're also really depressed when they graduate and they can't find anything. So I don't know what your original question was. I've lost it already, but that's my feelings on that.
Sure. Yeah. So moving back to the earlier days at Disney, you're starting to animate characters on feature films. Beauty and the Beast, you're getting to work on Cogsworth.
Yeah.
But then eventually you get to supervise animation for Pumbaa from The
Yeah.
Lion King. Can you, for the listening audience, can you talk about some of the differences between simply I'm animating Cogsworth on this
Right.
picture versus I'm now supervising the
Leading a character.
animation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and in those days, I guess the best way to define this too, that's helpful, is that put it in the context that at that time at Disney, directors were staffing their projects like a live action director chose an actor. We were animating just that one character. It was a kind of called the unit system, and we were cast as there was a supervisor and then kind of a staff of under animators, if you will, working with that supervisor to create that one character. So in Pumbaa, I that was my first opportunity where I was cast and chosen to be the part of just like a live action person, play the part of Pumbaa. And I didn't touch any other characters. I just animated Pumbaa. So that way we could get a higher level of acting, understanding of the character, drawing of the character, more on model, hopefully. And that's what the unit system was really strong at back then. That's been kind of disbanded over the years, especially with CG animation. But back then in 2D animation, it was really important because then you could really learn how to draw the character better than anybody else. And one of the tasks as a supervised animator is everybody underneath you, all of your team of animators underneath you that's doing Pumbaa. I was responsible for going over their drawings too. It wasn't just talking about performance and, oh, Pumbaa wouldn't do that, or maybe try this, or we can squash his face more and things here. It was also, oh, that's off model. I'm going to do drawings before it goes to cleanup and help out cleanup team. So I had that extra responsibility as a supervisor. But yeah, I started out as what we call a unit animator, working with Will Finn, and him as my supervising animator on one first Cogsworth on Beauty and the Beast, and then I went on to Aladdin to work with him again on Iago. I learned so much because it was that unit system gave me the opportunity to have more of a mentorship with my supervising animator. I was only working with him before the directors. I would show him my animation. We would talk over the scenes. He would do drawovers over my character poses and things. And I learned so much from that system of working. And it helped me to grow to a point where I felt confident, or at least somewhat confident. I was still pretty young when I got cast on Pumbaa on The Lion King, but at least I saw how it went for a couple pictures as what a supervisor does, and learned from really one of the best. And Will was a great mentor and supervisor for me over a couple pictures. Actually, it was three because I started with him on Rescuers Down Under when he was doing Frank the Frilled-Necked Lizard,
Oh yeah.
and then Cogsworth, then Iago. And he was kind of the king of comedy at Disney. He was the guy, he was typecast, like a lot of actors do, as being the comedy guy. And he loved it. And I picked up on that. I didn't know what my niche was going to be because, yeah, you do have to have a niche when you're in a unit system like that. The director's got to know, oh, he's good with drawing the lead character or females, or this one is a better draftsman. So we're going to put him on human characters, or this one is good with comedy, or this one is good with pathos and acting and drama, and or this one's good with action or something. And you do get typecast in a unit system like that. And I was so happy that I got typecast as a humor guy, a comedy guy. And it was really thanks to Will, bringing me up in comedy, along with just teaching me how to be a better overall animator and supervisor.
Cool. Yeah, Frank the Frilled Lizard is so funny in that movie. That movie I think is underrated for a number of reasons, but
Yeah.
fascinating. So then, like logistically, if you're really just focusing on one character, and I at this point still drawing on paper, how does that work? Are you doing a stack of animation, then handing it off to, let's say you're doing Cogsworth, and you've got to hand that off now to the guy doing Lumiere and vice versa?
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
I mean,
So
for scheduling, I think of the production people, production manager, producers, associate producers. There was a lot of them, but it was just a scheduling. It just complicated things so much. That's ultimately why they got rid of it when CG came around, because they're like, well, we don't have the value anymore of one guy knows how to draw this character the best, so we got to keep it with him. Now, we take the drawing part of it out and the model is the model, then now we can go to a system where you animate all the characters in your scene and maybe you have continuity and all this kind of stuff. But I preferred the unit system, even though it was from a production standpoint, a pipeline standpoint, difficult. But yeah, it's exactly what you say. There was a great scene, a sequence where, if you remember The Lion King, Pumbaa and Timon discover this lion in the desert, and he seems to be dead. And it's young Simba, as we know. Spoiler alert, and he's not dead. And they come up on him and they introduce themselves and they talk about their Hakuna Matata lifestyle and ultimately sing a song about it. So that sequence, though, when they come up upon him and all the way up to when the song starts, was a little sequence unto its own, this little intro into the song and intro of the characters. So I animated Pumbaa. Mike Suri, who was the supervising animator of Timon, did Timon. And my brother, my twin brother Tom, who was in Florida at the time working on the film, so we were 3,000 miles apart. He did young Simba. Mark Hen, he was working under young Mark Hen, who was doing as the supervisor on young Simba. And so the directors wanted us to like plan out all those scenes. And so, or I think we came up with the idea and we begged the directors to do this, but they flew out Tom from Florida for like 2 weeks. I think we had 2 weeks to kind of thumbnail out all that chunk of scenes and work on it. Of course, we procrastinated. We had fun. We went and saw some movies and whatever, and put it off to the last minute. And then we had like an all-nighter where we just like thumbnailed out everything and presented it to the directors the next day. And then Tom got on a plane and left the day after that. So, but I do remember it was just really cool. We not only thumbnailed out and figured out, who is what the characters were doing and how they would relate, but we also figured out who was going to go first. Who's the dominant animator on the scene. Oftentimes it was Pumbaa in a lot of ways because he's a stage unto himself. He's like, especially for Timon's usually on his nose or on his head or something like that. And when there's that physical quality of a character on top of another character, then usually the big bassy bottom character has to go first because Pumbaa was a stage for Timon a lot of times. Or it's just a big presence, or whoever has the most dialogue in the scene is leading the scene. So oftentimes that was Mike with Timon, who was very chatty. So, but yeah, we that was part of the planning, was in that thumbnail stage, was deciding who was going to go first. And sometimes that was communicated with the directors. Sometimes they didn't care, that you guys figured out, kind of thing. But the production people always cared, and they would follow up. They would follow up with us. Okay, what was decided on this scene? Who's going first, second, third? What are we doing here? And then they would monitor the heck out of that process for
Wow.
sure.
Does that, so let's say you start the scene because you're Pumbaa, um, in this particular sequence. Does
Yeah.
that is that more pressure on you to get the timing right, or is that a bit of a dance?
Yeah, and a lot of times what the animators would do, and we were very all the animators I worked with at Disney were so flexible about this, is it helped if that animator that was doing, say, Pumbaa or whatever that first character is, would kind of rough in the other characters, at least for placement, and then if there was any interaction that you knew kind of when that happened, and then as a courtesy, but also as a professional thing to do, you would show your first pass to the other animators and say, this is what I'm thinking. And the overall was already discussed, and we did that in the thumbnailing planning stage. But at least they could kind of speak into the timing of like there was a scene I remember where Timon just like hits Pumbaa's nose, and just like, yeah, like Pumbaa here, and he just like kind of whacks his nose. Well, I wanted to animate a little reaction for the hit, so but that's where you might go back and forth and back again, because I might rough it out without the impact, and then Michael do a little Timon slap to the nose, and then it might come back to me just before the scene goes to cleanup, really, and I'll animate because it's such a small thing, I'll animate a little nose reaction
Hmm.
to the slap. But every scene can be a little different, and it really depends on the action and staging and all that kind of stuff too.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I think when I think about kind of the list of Disney characters, to me, Pumbaa strikes me as one of the ones that I mean, it is really quite finely animated, frankly, because I think, when I watch the action and the motion, it seems really, really, really hard to turn that muzzle in perspective all the different ways that you do,
Yeah.
all the different times. So this is Pumbaa's your first time supervising that animation. What was that like when you get that opportunity? Because, on the one hand, this is a step up for you. On the other hand, I've heard that The Lion King was sort of the picture that no one yet believed in. So
Yeah.
for you as a lead, does that feel like there's greater freedom because people aren't looking forward to this one as much, or does it feel more intimidating because you're in a lead position?
Um, I mean, both really, but the first is true in that it took a lot of weight off of us to know that, but it also put a chip on our shoulder, I guess, to prove ourselves. But us being a very young green group, and I'm talking about down the line on The Lion King. The directors were first timers, the supervising animators, heads of department. There was barely anybody that had actually been in that role on The Lion King. It was probably the most green. I tell this all the time, and probably the most green crew on a film since Snow White. Because that was like everybody was new at making a feature on Snow White. So, but for us, it was the main guys that had the most experience had already moved on to Pocahontas and including Glenn Keane and stuff. So it was a lot of the junior animators that got promoted. It was a lot of the assistant layout people that got promoted ahead of layout and all that kind of stuff. And so it was a pretty extraordinary thing. And I don't think I'm answering your question now, Wes. Which direction were you going with that?
I was just looking for your personal experience as you're moving on to this project, which is simultaneously intimidating
Oh,
being a first time, but then
yeah.
also the air in the studio as well. This one doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, and for me, I felt extra young. There was a group of us that were kind of the young Turks. It was me and Mike Surrey and Brian Ferguson and a couple of those guys that were particularly young and and we were close friends. We would hang out and go to lunch all together and stuff and talk about what we're gonna do and how exciting it was to be there and all that kind of stuff. And um, I just remember that excitement and nervousness both at the same time. When my heart would beat fast, it was probably both of those things driving it. That feeling of anxiety, like I don't want to screw this up, and that feeling of I can't wait to get in here and do this, and it's going to be awesome. So I kind of didn't even know how to really read my heart from time to time because those feelings were just so linked together. Um, but more than anything, and certainly 2020 hindsight, as I look back, it was like such a great time, such a exciting time. All I remember is the fun stuff. But I do know that I was feeling a lot of pressure and a lot of anxiety about it because I didn't feel worthy. It was all that imposter syndrome kind of stuff. And yet, and I didn't really think about this is where the second part of your question, like because because it because nobody really thought that much of Lion King, it felt kind of experimental. It felt kind of like we'll see what happens with this, and there may be some changes halfway through that we might have to make. Like the studio was like really leery about it, and there was some changes in casting and roles for the animators early on, but not too much. Mostly, we all took on the mantle that we were given and rose to the occasion and made a film that we were really proud of. And we just every step of the way we fell in love with the story of Lion King more and more. Because I'll tell you, Wes, when they first pitched it to us, I remember going to an early meeting where the directors, Rob and Roger, who had never directed together, and both had never directed a feature before, and they were pitching this idea, and it was like, and Don Hahn, who was a very experienced producer, was there too, and I remember them putting a spin on it of like, well, it's it's something like it's Shakespeare in the Serengeti with music by the Rocket Man. And we were like, what? And we'd come off of doing all these films before this that was, very Broadway-esque, very, Howard Ashman, Alan Menken. And we were like, okay, I know what that is because we've done a couple. We've done Beauty and the Beast. We've done Aladdin by that point. And now we're rolling on this thing. And it's like, oh, it's a musical because that's what we do now. But Howard and Ashman and Alan Menken are not part of it. Now we got Elton John and this guy, Tim Rice, who nobody knew. And it was like knowing who Elton John was and not knowing who Tim Rice was and not seeing how songs and because they also said, well, we want it to be part Bambi too. It's got to have that draftsmanship and quality of realism in the anatomy and the drawing of the animals, the understanding of the animals, like Bambi. And so we were trying to go like, well, how does that fit into this raucous kind of Elton John musical with these kind of more, are they realistic animals? So trying to find the tone of that and what it was, because it was so unique and original, but also borrowing upon things that we had already done in the way of a musical. We just couldn't comprehend it for a long time. It was confusing. And yet somehow it came together, and I think it's really just the will of the crew. I want to say even more than, and I really feel like the directors would say this too, the will of the crew to prove themselves, to make something of it that really brought it together. We had a great, they were all young storyboard artists and stuff like that, but we had Chris Sanders on there. You look back and there was some really talented people on there, but they were unknown talents at the time.
Mm-hmm.
They were still yet to prove themselves, and a lot of them did it on that film.
Yeah, that's crazy to hear because, from my perspective, I was a kid when it came out, and
thank you for making me feel old.
I mean, I was a young man.
It's okay.
And some of those names, they're the legends, Andreas Deja, Tony Fucilli, Brendan Chapman, you guys. It's
Brendan
like
Chapman, yeah.
Guys, the next generation of greatness. And so it's crazy to think that you guys were all in the same picture. B, you hadn't yet proven yourselves at that point.
Yeah.
Um,
But we had all worked together on previous films, and that was good. I mean, because up until that was a dramatic point in the history of the studio where Jeffrey Katzenberg's like, we're having great success. We're making so much money. We got Beauty and the Beast. We got Aladdin. It's going up and up. Oh, and Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin. Now let's separate it into two crews and we can make twice as much money. I mean, he was just like foaming at the mouth during that period of like, we got to do it more. And people want it. And it was exciting. And we were getting caught up in that too. But mostly what we saw at the time was like, oh my gosh, they want to make two films now. Well, one, that means, hiring new people, which was great because we brought in some new energy and blood. But two, it meant really an opportunity for all of us young Turks that I was talking about, all of us that were like, oh, it'll be 5 years or 10 years before we supervise. We're not going to get a chance for a long time, but we're okay. We're like, well, this is how it is here. Everything changed when Jeffrey was like, nope, we're going to make Lion King and Pocahontas at the same time.
hmm,
And
wow.
everything, we all split. We were one unit before, and then we split and added.
Hmm, wow. That's interesting. Um, so I want to start moving into Mulan and you being tap director. But before I do, one from the outside looking in, one seemingly common thread with a lot of directors, particularly during the Disney Renaissance, was I hear a lot of guys in interviews saying like, "Why me?" Being tapped to direct a picture completely by surprise.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, um, looking back, can you see some of the strategy in doing that? And what do you think as you're considering someone in the production pipeline? What do you think are some key ingredients? Okay, this person might be a good director.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what you say, Wes, is true. Is that at that time, I remember I was always ambitious. My brother and I both were kind of raised that way to aspire for greatness and aspire for more and try and, so going, I was very keen on always thinking about how do I go up the ladder. And I want to do that. Whether I didn't feel worthy or ready, but there was this drive in me to always look into that. So how it happened for me is Rob Minkoff, who later would become one of the co-directors of Lion King. When I first started, it was at the Disney Florida studio in Orlando, Florida. It was their Disney MGM Studios theme park, and they had an animation building. And we were there just doing, and we were all young, super young. This is the Young Turks, the Aaron Blazes, and me and Tom, and all these people that started there. And we were assigned to do shorts only, and it was going to be Roger Rabbit shorts, Mickey Mouse shorts. That was the plan when that studio first opened. And then what quickly started happening is the success of the features. They pulled us into the features, and at first we'd do 5% of Rescuers Down Under, and then 10% of Aladdin, and then we're doing a larger share on each different feature as we're growing and proving ourselves as a studio in Florida, to the point where on Lion King, Aaron Blaze was in charge of young Nala and Mark Hen was in charge of young Simba. And, so they were supervising. We had a sequence to do in Florida, which was Can't Wait to Be King, was totally done in the Florida studio. So they were giving us large chunks of the movie at that time. But where am I going with this? So when I first got to know Rob Minkoff, I was a cleanup assistant, like an in-betweener, really, just starting my journey in animation. And one night he came by my desk and he said, "Where do you see yourself?" We were just jib-jabbing and talking. And he's like, "Where do you see yourself and ultimately here at Disney? What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, truthfully, I want to be a director like you, Rob." And he was just directing his first animated short. So he was like a newbie at that.
Hmm.
And he's like, "Wow, okay. All right." And he kind of tucked that away, and we stayed friends. And so when he gave me the opportunity, he was one of the main voices that gave me the opportunity to become a supervising animator on Lion King. And he'd been watching my growth as an animator on Aladdin and other films, Beauty and the Beast and stuff like that. And the story I heard was how I became a co-director on Mulan was that literally after The Lion King, and of course it's a huge success, and Rob as the director is looking like the golden boy, cannot do no wrong. And he was walking out to the parking structure with Tom Schumacher, who was then the vice president of feature animation, head of development. And Tom turns to Rob and says, you know, we got this new movie coming up, The Legend of Mulan, or Legend of Fa Mulan, as it was called back then. Barry Cook is directing, and we're looking for a co-director, somebody from the animation side, probably to balance his skills as an effects animator. And who you recommend? Just throw out, because they had already looked at names. They would talked to some people. Nobody wanted to move to Florida because that's what it meant ultimately. And Rob said, well, what about Tony Bancroft? I know he wants to direct. And it was that conversation I had 5 years before with him that implanted a seed that resonated with him when he was walking to the parking structure with Tom Schumacher, who was a decision maker. And Tom just kind of looked at him and said, we hadn't thought of that name. Okay. And literally it was out of the blue, but it was because of Rob and making that connection with him years before, and proving myself and working hard and all that kind of stuff too, and working under him on Pumbaa. And he saw me rise in my leadership skills that gave him the confidence to recommend me, and everything went into place after that. And I got asked to be on a co-director, and it totally surprised me. Like literally, I don't know, it was probably weeks later after that conversation, I get a call into Tom Schumacher's office. It felt like being called into the principal's office. I had never been into his office or had a one-on-one conversation really with him, hardly at all. And so for me to call, and I went home and I told my wife, I said, on Friday, they want me to come in and see Tom Schumacher. I said, it's one of two things. I'm either canned and I'm going to get my pink slip, because that always happened on Fridays. You know, they wanted you to like quietly go away into the night. And then by Monday, everybody's like, where's Tony? oh, didn't you hear he got laid off? And it's already over. I said, I'm either going to get laid off on Friday, or maybe they're going to promote me. And that even seemed more ludicrous. Like I felt like I was more closer to being laid off than I was to being promoted. And yet I just couldn't figure it out. So yeah, when I sat down in his office and he asked me, we got this film, I knew right where he was going, called Mulan, because I knew they were looking for a second director to work with Barry on Mulan. So right when he started speaking about Mulan, I thought, oh my gosh, my heart just sunk, in that moment of going, I thought I was getting laid off, and here I am getting this like dream come true promotion. And I just tried to play it cool. Well, give me the weekend. I got to talk to my wife. I got to think about it. Sounds interesting. Yeah. And inside I'm like, yes. Of course. I was just so totally excited. But yeah, that's how it, and every director has to your question, every director has their own trajectory. But I will say that for most of us, it is that kind of comes out of the blue moment. I feel like you could kind of wrangle. I remember asking early on, like, what do I have to do? I think it was one of the few times I talked to, Peter Schneider, the president of feature animation. I just said, like, what does somebody do to become a director? And it was always this kind of ambiguous thing of like, well, go to screenings and give your notes. Let us see that you have directorial viewpoints and you understand story structure. And that's all they would point to, is like, go to screenings on films that you're working on and give notes, and written notes that they would read. And then they'll see if your notes make sense or that they like your notes. And that's usually a good way to show that you have story chops or something. I never did that. I was always intimidated. So I never did. I never even took that recommendation. And yet still somehow I got asked, and it was really through relationship. So it bodes well to make good connections. That's the summary of that story.
Huh. So one of the things now you're moving on to director. It's a feature film. So one of the things that necessarily changes, I think, from your perspective, is going to be scope. Now you're
Yeah.
sort of over all the little pieces over a 4-year period. And as I told you when I initially reached out, um, I mean, I think to date, Mulan is still probably the most I've ever laughed in the theater, which was at the time inconvenient because I was trying to suppress a cough and I kept laughing. um, but anyway, I guess my question there is, humor. How do you make sure that those jokes are still going to land when you've been with this project uh, for years? You've heard this joke 100,000 times. How do you keep perspective uh, on that?
Boy, that's a great question, and you're right. It is a long journey, and what often happens is that what was funny to you once is no longer funny after through time, and that's true in life, but true on a film too. And we just have to you have to kind of just remember, oh, this was funny to me once, you know, even though I totally expect it coming now and all that kind of stuff. And the best way to do that, of course, is always bringing in fresh audiences, show it to your kids, or ultimately with Disney films, you'll have a studio audience that sees it, go to the AMC theater and they'll screen it and get reactions and stuff. And then it really brings to life the stuff that is funny. But then the other funny thing that happens with that is that we get so used to what's funny in the West and we forget that we're making a universal film. And then I remember going to once the film was done, we premiered it in Hong Kong, and had a huge screening. And I thought, well, this is their personal story. This is the Chinese people's personal story. They know Mulan. They were raised with Mulan. They're going to either love it or they're going to stone us for it in the streets. And I had that same kind of feeling of like, what's going to happen? I don't know. And they loved it, thankfully. But the most surprising thing was watching it. And we told them we don't want to have any kind of translation in our ears. We just want to watch it in Mandarin, with the audience in Mandarin, and hearing how they responded to things. And then we were very much more into like listening to their reactions, but hearing how they responded to things. Like one thing that was a very Western thing that we didn't really realize, I guess, was there's a joke in there where, Mulan's in the army and she's getting up in the morning, and Mushu comes in and wakes her up in the tent, and he's like, I got breakfast for you, and it's happy to see you. And he, slaps this like bowl of porridge and with eggs and stuff and bacon on it, and it looks like a funny face. Very IHOP kind of Western humor, I guess, is that you get a breakfast and it's got a funny face on it made out of the food. In China, that was just like no reaction whatsoever. Nobody laughed. I thought at the very least it's kind of a funny picture, but no, there was no context for it. They thought it was odd. At best. At best, it was odd. And at worst, it was just like, okay, yeah, breakfast. All right. Next scene, what's going to happen? But yeah, there was definitely things that work for us that we discovered, that are not universal jokes and stuff like that. And Eddie is a very Western, urban kind of humor that they weren't used to either. But that's the other thing you don't realize when you're making it, or you don't think about a lot, is that all these great voices that you have that are Eddie Murphy and whatever, and that are very popular here in the US, they find somebody else to do those voices. They don't hear Eddie Murphy in Mandarin. It's some other guy trying to kind of impersonate the tone or the speed and rhythm of the character, and that's about it. So we rely on the fact that they're going to get a good actor too that'll keep that tempo going. But yeah, I think overall sense of humor was not skewed to Mushu as much as it was in the Western audience. It was skewed towards Mulan. When she would do something physical or when she would screw up, they would laugh in a bigger way than anything that the dragon did.
So one of the sort of mental exercises I like to do every now and then when I'm thumbing through somebody's art of book is just pretend let's say I get to direct this picture and I'm thumbing through all this artwork, and what do I pick? And I'm always a little bit discouraged because the movie that came out, I think, is better than the version that I'm wanting to make based on the artwork I'm seeing.
Hmm.
How do you hone in on that style? I mean, I know you're not doing it alone, but as the director, that artwork really is coming across your desk, and you really are having to say yay or nay. How are you sort of finding the soul, the look, the spirit of Mulan?
Yeah. Well, and it's particularly difficult at Disney where they spend Disney and Pixar traditionally has always spent a lot of money in their development budget to hiring different artists to find a different style, to create locations that are unique. They do a lot of research, right? I think it's part of the world building at Disney and Pixar that is so thorough and wonderful. But it can be the most difficult thing as a director. Too many choices. There's so many choices. And they're all great choices because we always hire the best people that we can find, and new artists are always budding up, and that is really difficult. But it's really the difference of the director. And I think you kind of hit upon it even within your question, Wes, is that it's what we are as unique as artists, and certainly as directors as every other choice that you could have as a director. I firmly believe that Ron and John, who are directors at Disney, or Kirk and Gary, those team up mashups, if they have the same material placed in front of them for Mulan, meaning story, script, visuals, they would make totally unique and different films than what Barry and I did. And it's only because we were put in charge for whatever reason that it came out the way it did. And I'm not trying to say that to our credit. I just think it's natural and human nature that we all just see things differently. So what I'm attracted to visually, not only, I mean, that's what makes it hard to have a co-director too, because it's not the same even as Barry, but hopefully somewhere in the middle between Barry and I exists this place that Mulan rose out of. And it's unique and it's different only because we're unique and different from any other directing team. And that, to me, that's the only way to answer that question. It's because that's the only thing I can figure out.
Yeah. No, that's great. It seems to resonate with something I had once heard director Gendy Tartakovsky say in an interview when he was asked, like, what advice do you give? And he said, have a perspective and stick to it, because ultimately there's going to be a better artist. There's going to be a better animator. What you bring to the table is your perspective, which I think is kind of what you just described.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, I think that's a great way of saying it too, is that it's that perspective, that point of view. It's the same answer I have when people talk about style. And so many young artists are always like, what's my style? What's my style? And when am I going to find my style? I'm like, it's going to find you. It develops out of your perspective of what you like. Everything that you take in, basically you're plagiarizing all the time by looking at all this other artwork, and you're distilling it into, and through the ability of that you can actually scribble it down on a piece of paper. That's what makes your style, is everything around you that you like, that you can, and then your bad definition of that through your own art ability, because usually it is never good enough. It's never what we want it to be that we see in our mind. So it's a combination of everything that we like and the worst transcribing of it that we can do, probably, and that's going to be your style.
That's a pretty good way of describing it. We're coming short on time, so I want to move on and touch just briefly. So now you've directed Mulan, and you go on to The Emperor's New Groove, and you end up supervising another iconic character, Krunk.
Wrong.
Going into Krunk, now that you've directed, now that you've been on top and sort of seen the whole process, does that change the way you go into animating him as opposed to when you first were doing Pumbaa? And how did that change your perspective, having directed a feature
Well,
film?
one, I had the confidence going into Emperor's New Groove of I've done both roles. I've been a supervising animator on a character, so I know what that is, but I've also seen the bigger picture of what it means to be a director, so I could see things in the macro like never before. Because when you train as an animator, you're always thinking in the micro, like what are the little elements I'm going to bring to this, or I know I got to get a character from point A to point B, but what are the little blinks or head turns or moves or something that I'm going to do that's going to make a resonance, a quality of subtext that I maybe want to get across or something like that in the acting. And you're thinking about the minutia of performance and visually what that looks like. And then you start directing, and this was one of the biggest hurdles I had going from animating Pumbaa to now directing Mulan was all of a sudden I'm thinking about these. That's why I always say it was like a roller coaster for me and a headache at the end of the day because I was thinking about story and one little change here and the ripple effect that it has way over here in this sequence and how does that affect the overall arc of the character and all these bigger thoughts that I would take home and just be rattling around in my head gave me such headaches at night, or made it hard to sleep. That was the real difference. But now I'm going back into the micro of being an animator on Emperor's New Groove, but I still have the fun and joy of being able to enjoy and see and appreciate what is his role in arc. And so I could have conversations with Mark Dendel, the director, and he really respected me for having just done Mulan, which was really cool. But I also had to kind of fold myself in. I'm not a second director on this, and I wanted to make sure Mark knew that I'm not coming across as that. If you want my opinion on things, on bigger issues of story and stuff, I'd love to give it. And he was always very generous in listening. But ultimately, I learned more about directing than I did on animating. I'm working on that film because I got to work under another new director. I'd never worked with Mark before, and his style was totally different from any other director I'd worked with. I totally loved it. I totally appreciated it. I learned, that's what I feel like I learned more than anything was how does a single director, not a duo, direct a movie like this? And he was great. I have total admiration for him, and I felt like I went away better for the experience of working on that film than probably he did having me work on the film. I really feel that way. Plus, I had Patrick Warburton as a voice, and
Yeah.
he was the whole reason I did it. Was like I heard Patrick was going to do the voice. I'm like, oh, sign me up. Oh yeah, I want to do that. Yeah, it was like an easy choice.
So I've noticed you have, and your brother too. There's been a relationship, or is there a relationship? You've worked with a voice actor, uh, creating a character in this movie that you later go on to have in another movie. So, for instance, the character of Iago, you're working with the recording of Iago in Animal Crackers. An
Yeah,
actor shows up again. I know that you worked on Mulan. Ming Na Wen becomes a friend and ends up working with you guys again.
yeah,
I've seen, as you watch the career of you and your brother, you see some of those threads
yeah.
come
We had like
through.
3 or 4 actors that I worked with in the past on Animal Crackers, and it's because I admired them. I liked them. It was a great, in the Disney days, we had a great, so Patrick, yeah, Gilbert Gottfried, Harvey Firestein was in Animal Cracker, and I worked with him on Mulan. So, and I want to say there was at least one or two more that we brought onto the film. But then I've worked with Patrick on probably 5 projects. I brought him on to another thing that I was like the voice director on in Korea, called uh, Red Shoes and the Seven Dwarves. It was based on,
Mm.
Snow White.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I brought him on as the Magic Mirror, which he
Mm.
did a great job on. So
Mm.
yeah, I've enjoyed those relationships, and I feel like there's a lot of value in having those relationships where you're like, I know what I'm going to get from this person. So if that's what this feature needs, then why not go to the original instead of somebody that's trying to imitate that and do their own version?
Yeah, no, that's great. We're running short on time, so I'll just narrow this down to two last questions. The first question I'm always curious about is because you were at the Disney studio working on some of the biggest movies in the world, um, because you're working on The Lion King, you're not working on Pocahontas. Because you're working on Mulan, you're not working on, Hercules or Tarzan or whatever.
Right.
Is there, in a perfect world, let's say you got to work on any Disney movie you wanted, including the one you did work on, is there a Disney
Yeah.
picture or a character that you would have loved to have a go at?
Oh yeah. I mean, Tarzan, seeing that happen from afar was hard. I would have loved to have been on that. My buddy Mike Surrey, who did Timon, he did some comedy characters in that. The little Rosie O'Donnell, gorilla character was his. Um, Not really Hercules. It wasn't anything, or Sweating Bullets. Or sorry, it was Home on the Range. Um, I didn't really see anything there for me, or even Atlantis was interesting, only from the standpoint it wasn't like a great comedy movie, and I'm definitely want to be part of a comedy thing wherever it is. But when they first talked about the next 5 years, we always do these town hall meetings with all the animators, and this is what's coming up. And they just put up the logo for Atlantis, and it was so cool. And the whole Mike Magnolia is a part of it and stuff. People stood up and like standing ovation. They were
Oh
excited
wow.
about it. I don't think it ever had as much life and appeal to it as that first day when they announced it was showing the logo. Unfortunately, I feel like it went downhill after that. But yeah, there was part of me that was like everybody else, like, oh, I wish I could work on that. That's cool. There's
Oh,
something
cool.
cool about it. It was like it wasn't rated R, but it was like more adult, and I don't know. It was like, yeah,
Yeah. Final question. I do kind of want to tie this into your brother's directing a new feature film, Light of the
yeah,
World. But you guys have both been in this industry for a couple of decades. So,
35 years at least. Yeah,
which is awesome. Uh, what uh, what has changed um, from when you guys got in feature animation, and what has remained the same? Probably not going to change as you see, even going into Light of the World, where a lot of
yeah.
things have. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the industry has changed a lot. But I think even more so, Tom and I have changed. And for me personally, I've changed in the way that I don't get as much thrill working on a big studio project. I know that's always like the younger generation is like, well, I want to work for Disney, I want to work for Warner Brothers. It's the brand name that's so attractive. But having done that and been there and gotten the t-shirt, I feel like I'm more about, you know, working on special projects that really resonate with me personally, or that I think I'm going to get some new opportunity out of, or do something unique that I haven't done before. And I'm still thankfully at a point in my career where I want new challenges. I'm always looking for not only what's the next thing that's going to pay the bills, that's still the least of it. I remember the first paycheck I got at Disney, I was like, oh, I get paid for this too. I've always been led by, and I think most of us artists are, but led by the appeal of the project, the artist side driving me, the storyteller side of me driving me more than the paycheck. It's why I'm not wealthy, I'm sure. I know my wife would love for me to seek out the dollar first, but for me, it's always about creative challenges. And so the independent market has been more appealing to me over the last, I don't know, 15 years than anything the studios are doing. Although I've dabbled by going back to studio work here and there, especially as an animator. But when it comes to making films and directing or being in a supervising role, I'm more interested in the smaller projects, the independents out there. They're harder to make. They're more difficult to get going and all that, but there's so much more creative freedom on in that regard. When I did Animal Crackers, which you mentioned and we got it released on Netflix, I think it might still be there. There was just like three of us in a room that had pretty much all the authority to make any kind of changes we want. And really, two of us, me and my co-director, Scott Saba, had most all the creative freedom we wanted to just, and that was so liberating. And once I got kind of intoxicated by that, I was like, I just want to do more films like this where I don't have a committee or a bunch of executives or even investors that have a lot of say. And then Light of the World has been that for Tom and I, going on to that. Tom's the co-director. He's my boss on this one. I'm the animation director on it, but he and his co-director partner, John Schaefer, I just really admire what they're doing, and I want to fold into just helping them make the best movie that we can make. It's all 2D animated. Now, this one has an extra pull for me because I'm a man of faith, a Christian, and I've always wanted to use my skill sets to make something that was more resonant and had a just a larger impact upon the audience than just a couple giggles and laughs, you know. And so, Light of the World is a story about Jesus Christ through the eyes of John, the disciple that Jesus is said to was his favorite. They had a close relationship. And in our film, we play John as a 15-year-old seeker, you know, and he is just trying to figure out who this. He's heard rumor and legend of this, you know, wonderful, magnificent Messiah coming to save the Jews, and they all have different ideas of what that means, and he has to go on his own journey of figuring out not only if he believes in the Messiah, but also is this guy Jesus that he meets, which is really as a friend first, can he really be the Son of God? What does that mean? And so it's really all through his idea, and that was really why I say it's kind of the culmination of my career to work on this and have this opportunity, is because I feel like it was for a time such as this that God really helped me to gain my knowledge and understanding of animation, storytelling, to a point that I could really pour into this little story. And I say little story because it's obviously one of the biggest stories in the universe, the Bible. We have good source material, and yet. To do it well and to do it through a lens of also making it entertaining, which is something that doesn't happen a lot, unfortunately, in the Christian market. Entertainment is always put aside for, well, you got to stick to exactly what, and he didn't say this or do this, and he wouldn't have winked twice here or whatever. You know, we've tried to really make it authentic and real to the Bible, but also have fun with the elements that are not talked about in the Bible, the moments in between where we could invent a little bit more. We gave ourselves that freedom to do that. And I feel like we've made something unique, not only in the Christian market, but also in the entertainment market. I think people are going to like it. I'm really happy about how it looks too. I mean, it's classic 2D animation in a lot of ways, and yet still has kind of a new, fresh graphic and stylized look to it too. All like Cartoon Saloon, kind of Secret of Kells kind of thing. And I mean, a lot of people are saying we're releasing some images right now on Instagram and stuff. Look for Light of the World, do some searches, you'll find it. And a lot of people are, of course, comparing it to the DreamWorks film,
Prince of Egypt.
Prince of Egypt. We get a lot of that, but I also feel like, well, okay, they're all wearing robes and there's a lot of similarities, same time period, location,
Sure.
costumes. People are always going to do that. I mean, you do anything with like a Chinese girl and they're going to always go, oh, that's Mulan, you know, so I kind of get tired of those kind of comparisons. It's not very original, but I do think it looks pretty unique and different, and we're just happy with where the story's going, and it'll be out summer of next year.
Yeah, that'll be great. That'll be great. Yeah, there's a hungry market, I think, for work like that.
Yeah.
So it's great that you guys are doing that. We are at time. Tony, thank you so much.
Let me do one more shout out if you don't mind, Wes, and that
Please.
is I'm doing a Expo too. My brother and I both like we don't have enough time in the day, and we're making time to make Nashville's very first, the South's really first professional animation expo. So if you've heard of all the great ones in California and you're like, oh, that's too far, Nashville, Tennessee, next year, February 21st through 23rd, hosted on Lipscomb University's campus where I teach, where will be our very first Animation Y'all Expo. And so please come out for that if you're at all interested in animation or want to learn more, you're a professional and want to dig deeper in your career. A lot of local talent and studios, and a lot of national artists that you follow will be there as guests of the convention too.